Hello and welcome to The Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll be bringing some of the very best interviews and reports from the whole year here on Monocle Radio. And this week, we talk with guests including Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgaard.
You are outside of the place you are in, but you're also outside of the country you come from. So to me, it's always been like a perfect place to be a writer because I'm always on the outside.
Plus, the new creative director of Uniqlo, Claire Wade Keller.
All the men's, all the women's, all the socks, everything that you regularly see in a Uniqlo store, I now look at as part of my design remit.
All that and much more in the next hour here on The Curator with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. And this show, we're celebrating the best of 2024 here on Monocle Radio. We'll start with a special interview from Monocle's brand new podcast. It's called Monocle on Fashion. And in this particular episode, Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Theodosi, spoke with the new creative director of Uniqlo, Claire Wade Keller, who was previously the artistic director of brands including Chloé and Givenchy. She spoke about her unorthodox career move, the joy in designing for the many, and what the Japanese fashion business can teach its European counterparts.
It's a global director role at Uniqlo, and that means that I oversee basically everything that you look at in the store, except for the kids. I'm not involved in the kids' wear, but all the men's, all the women's, all the socks, everything that you regularly see in a Uniqlo store, I now look at as part of my design remit. So this role was something that kind of organically grew as I've been starting to work with Uniqlo over the last couple of years. We had launched my collaboration collection last September, but previous to that, I'd actually been working with the group for about a year, planning that collaboration, doing the collection design and also naming it, doing all the labeling, trademarking, everything else that we need to do to prep a launch for a new collaboration. And so as part of that process, I was spending a lot of time in Tokyo and with the team in Ariake, which is near the port in Tokyo, where the big Uniqlo offices are. And at that stage, you're kind of seeing a lot of things around the office of what they do on a global scale. And I started to just get involved in a lot of the meetings and discussions. And so it grew from conversations from there. And then we started talking about, well, actually, it could be interesting to look at this as a whole big opportunity because the brand itself is so well loved and also has such an incredible reputation. And they are one of the few brands on the high street who is really known for innovation. And so that, for me, was the big draw.
And why? I mean, you mentioned innovation. I'm sure that was a big draw and how loved the brand is. But I think it was still a very unexpected move for someone who made their career in luxury. Why did you decide to take a very different turn? I think your name was on everyone's lips as there's so many open positions in luxury houses. They were wondering if you would take one of them, if you'd be interested in returning to that world. And then you surprised everyone by taking on this new role at Uniqlo.
I think for me, I've always taken quite surprising moves in my career. And I think over the last decade or two, many people have said, oh my God, I didn't expect you to come show up there. And I think that's part of what I search for and what I look for is the surprise, is the challenge, is the thing that is completely off-piste in a way, because that makes for one, an interesting journey for me, but it also brings interesting challenges. And I think as a designer, it's very easy to go from the same type of job to another type of job. You're just doing it in a different umbrella. And as much as that's really an amazing career move as well, it also is something quite familiar. And so for me, I'm always really looking to be out of my comfort zone because that's where you learn the most. And I think, you know what? You're only on this planet for a short amount of time, and I just want to make it as interesting as possible.
And looking at your trajectory, like you say, you sometimes go off piste. You even within the luxury world, you've worked for such different companies, and that shows you put the brand in many ways first, or the customer, than your own singular vision, which is a very different way from the way that many other designers work. How do you manage to do that?
Not having a giant ego is one.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a very ego-driven approach usually with designers. Where wherever they go, they bring themselves and their image and their vision, while you kind of adapt to, you have your own signature, but it feels like you adapt much more to the customer that you're addressing and to the business that you work for.
100%. And I think actually that's one of the things there's one, well, he's passed now, but the one designer that I got to know very well while I was living in Paris, Karl Lagerfeld. And I always admired his kind of chameleon approach to working for different brands. And obviously he eventually did have his own brand, but it was never very significant because people felt his actual most significant work was what he did for other brands such as Chanel and Fendi and Chloe as well, which is where I first started talking to him, was when I was at Chloe, and we connected obviously from being at our time there. And for me, I really admired the fact that he morphed each time, and it was always really surprising what he was going to do, and it was different at each brand. And I think he was truly one of those designers who did try to immerse himself in the storytelling of the brand and then bring his own flavor to it. And I feel like I'm the same way. I'm not a designer that just imposes my look on a brand. Yes, there are certain designers that we can see today who you know what you're getting when they move to another brand. And that's reassuring for a lot of people, and it's great too. That's a different approach. But I like immersing myself in the story of a house and then trying to thread a new chapter in terms of what its cultural relevance is right now. So why brands such as when I went to Givenchy should be relevant, and what I'm bringing to it, and what's the new chapter that I'm taking there. It's not my chapter, it's the company's chapter. The company's going to be around much longer than I am. So for me, it's about really translating that and making it relevant to that moment in time.
And now we have a highlight from The Urbanist. We speak with the activist and horticulturist Tyshawn Hayden-Smith about his new book, Small Space Revolution, Planting Seeds of Change in Your Community, and how gardening can transform a community.
Gardening was never on the horizon, or was it even in my vocab? No, I don't think it really was. Horticulture definitely wasn't. And so reflecting on my upbringing, and this is not something I would have realized at the time, but I think my mum had a massive part to play in my admiration for nature. Like, she saw the world in art, like she stopped in awe and curiosity at the littlest of things, in such an urban inner city space. We grew up in Ladbroke Grove. My mum was a single mother of 4 of us. We lived in a council house. And so you can imagine how chaotic and how hectic everything was. My mum somehow always managed to just pull things together and make sure that there was a routine, that there was a schedule, that we all had more than enough love and things to do to interest us and excite us. But one of the things that I do remember growing up is that my mum, really was sensitive to nature, not in like a outright, quite vocal, or even something that you could observe from the outside. I mean, my mum was very gentle, very soft, very kind-spirited. But I think that all played into how she viewed herself in the world and as part of the ecosystem. And it'll be just small things like walking in Ladbroke Grove. And, like, this is my experience as a child. My mum would just stop in her tracks and look at the tree for a few seconds and go, "Kids, can you see the texture on the bark?" And sure enough, we'd all feel the tree and, spend a few seconds observing and admiring the tree before we just got up to mischief again. And then sunsets was my mum's thing. Like, she used to really adore sunsets and like the many different colours, and she would query us on the different colours that we could see in the sunset. And I think those were moments in which she found peace and she found, I guess, beauty in nature, and that clearly rubbed off on me.
Well, it's also a remarkable part of London, Ladbroke Grove, but also a part of London that is marked by a terrible tragedy, because where you grew up was very close to Grenfell Tower, where there was this tragic fire that killed so many people. But again, somehow you saw in there a tiny part of a complicated healing process with the community, something that you could do via gardening. Could you just tell listeners about what happened there?
That's where I landed, but I wouldn't say that I kind of saw a route forwards or an opportunity, or like in a moment like that where something so, I guess, so heavy and so tragic and so traumatic happens so close to home. And, people that I knew are no longer with us, and people that are still with us are traumatized by what happened. And that's something that we all have to live with for all of our lifetimes. And I guess for me, in the moments after Grenfell, I wasn't there necessarily when it started to happen, but I came back to absolute chaos in the morning of the fire, and it just stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't tell you what was going through my mind. I think if I was to describe how I was feeling, I think I was feeling very angry. I was feeling frustrated. I was feeling helpless. Like, there's not much you can do in a situation like that but to, I guess, seek understanding, to seek solace, and to try and express those really pent up emotions and tensions within you. And I say this kind of reflecting on it. I wouldn't have been able to communicate this at the time or even in the years following, because things were just happening, and you kind of go blank and you kind of go numb when something like Grenfell Tower claims 72 lives of people that you knew to be as neighbours and you knew to be as friends, and you used to play football with them and used to kind of engage with them, used to go around to their house, used to play with these people growing up, used to say hi to them on the street. And I just remember walking around in my area, and like you said, Ladbroke Grove is known as this vibrant, really eclectic, cultural melting pot of a place, very creative. And I'm so used to seeing joyful faces, and despite the adversity in the community and the social injustices and challenges like pre-Grenfell, you would be met with smiles and you'd be met with people welcoming and very happy, and that's the essence of the community in Ladbroke Grove. But all of a sudden, walking down the street in Ladbroke Grove, there's a vacancy in emotion. People were very, obviously, naturally very angry, very sad, and all those emotions that I explained that I felt at the time, everyone was feeling those emotions. And in those moments after Grenfell, it was important that we pulled together, and that whilst there was no strategy, there was no plan, and that could be said about any of the activisms, and probably something that could be said about activism in general following any tragedy. People just have an instinctive nature to just act on something and do something that will help or will support or will try and heal or unify and connect. And it just so happened that gardening would be the way in which I communicated myself.
Teshan, you saw a piece of land that you began to tend, and a story began there. So, as you say, no big plan or intention at the beginning, but just tell us a little bit about the gardening that began then.
Yeah, so, it didn't even start as gardening. It didn't even start as a garden. There was this derelict, barren patch of land in this red brick raised bed just offset of the motorway in a place called Maxilla. And Maxilla had become a place where people would congregate because it was under the Westway and it was quite a sheltered space. People would sit there, people would kind of express themselves through art. So you'd get a lot of graffiti and artwork on walls where people would express themselves in that way. And you'd get young children painting pictures of burning buildings and people jumping out of them. And it was really emotive and very heavy. I saw this space, it was just filled with litter and rubbish. And I just decided I was going to tidy it up a bit and make it a bit more respectable and respectful. And I guess I thought that didn't really reflect my community in the way that I knew my community to be. So yeah, I started to litter pick, and I really couldn't pin down that moment where I decided, okay, we're going to find some plants. Again, I don't think I even used the word garden at that point, but I knew that the soil needed life. And we went and found that in local garden centres and local nurseries that were offering whatever they can. And there was what we called the Grenfell Garden of Peace, where everyone was welcome to make the garden what they wanted to make it. And it would be a safe space where people can connect and unify and even just have a chat, even just share a smile, share a tear, and just have a shoulder to lean on.
You are listening to The Curator with the best of 2024 here on Monocle Radio. We have a highlight from the entrepreneurs now. We spoke with Ben Lan, co-founder and CEO of Colosso. He discussed his company's de-extinction technology, its mission to revive the woolly mammoth, and how genetic engineering can drive biodiversity conservation.
My background is in building teams of much smarter women and men than me, and I just like to work on really cool problems that are systems problems. So I like to build software systems, I built some space hardware systems, and I like to always continue to learn. And I met this guy, George Church. George is arguably the father of synthetic biology, and this was really George's vision, right? And so I'm one of those people that's insatiably curious. Like, I always want to go find the next thing. I'm always wanting to learn new ideas. And I met George, and I asked George, I was like, George, if you could have like unlimited capital for one of your crazy projects, because he's so famous, right? He's created so many innovations in genetics for the world. I said, if you had one project that you could work on for the rest of your life, what would it be? And he's like, I would bring back woolly mammoths. I would help increase biodiversity and increase ecosystem healthiness. And then I would also build technologies to help conservation. And then the call was over. And I was like, wait, was that a joke? And as this entrepreneur who said like 1,000 times, I want to change the world, I really thought like, if I don't do this, I'm a hypocrite. I have to go do this. And so I kind of like resigned my job and decided to go follow George on this crazy mission. What's crazy about Colossal is that Colossal, people just think of it as the lab, right? They're like, oh, it's just a bunch of really smart people in lab coats. And there is a lot of that, right? But a lot of this actually is like, we're going down into the archives of museums and getting museum samples, right? I'm on the board of trustees of the Explorers Club, right? And so we're also going out into the field and supporting other field research in search of ancient DNA. We're actually here in London supporting a movie that came out, which several of our scientific advisors are a part of, as well as our Chief Science Officer, Beth Shapiro. The movie's all about the search for the oldest ancient DNA, right? And it's amazing. The movie's amazing. I highly recommend everyone see it. But ultimately, what's crazy is that, like, for us, it's not just lab work. It's also got this crazy, like, I don't know if there's another movie other than Indiana Jones, but it has this like weird Indiana Jones component to it where it's like you're literally in like the catacombs of an old museum or the Smithsonian, and then you're constantly like in like the tundra, like digging up frozen mammoth pieces. So there is this like discovery component of it that feels a little bit like the movie.
Now, obviously that work is very difficult. I can't imagine the science that goes into it. Maybe you can talk to me a little bit about all that. But, on the more boring side, there's probably also a bureaucratic element that is crazy to navigate.
Yeah, people don't realize that, and I definitely, when I say people, I'm including myself in this. People do not realize how much stuff outside of just bringing back extinct species. Like, they're like, that seems really hard. I'm like, yeah, that's only half of it, though. We work with indigenous people groups. We work with local governments. We work with international governments, private landowners, the public at large, right? We've been very, very fortunate that so many people love the mission. But, there are people that just gut react to it. They're like, oh, this sounds like Jurassic Park. How do I feel about it, right? And so we constantly have to, like, do a good job of having conversations like this, educating the public of what we're doing. But there's so much of that part of it. We work very closely with American Humane, which is the oldest humane organization on the planet. And so it's like there's so many other components that are not just in the lab that I don't think people realize.
It is a radical concept, and the Jurassic Park aspect that you bring into it. Actually, I read an article recently. It was about the dodo and everything, and they were explaining that actually, well, you can't bring back dino DNA because it's so old.
That's correct. We don't want to break hearts. I don't want to get a Reddit group after me. Our chief science officer at a Fortune event actually said, we cannot de-extinct dinosaurs, and like Reddit like took off, and they gave her like, negative Nancy Saurus or something like that name. I forgot exactly what the name was. Just because she said, hey, we can't do this. Sorry.
How far away are we from seeing a woolly mammoth and a dodo again?
So the three questions we get all the time is, when are we going to see it? Can we make dinosaurs? Which we've hinted on. And then the last one is, what's next? I was like, well, can't we get a couple of these out before everyone keeps asking us what's the next animal? I love the bullishness that society has in our success, which is like one of the number one questions is, what's the next animal? I was like, well, let's get one of these out. So our goal is still 2028 for the mammoth. I feel like we are on track. We announced our induced pluripotent stem cells this year for the mammoth. I feel very good about the prospect of kind of where we are. We have some updates coming out on the thylacine. We have one big update coming out on the dodo at the end of the year. We have not set a timeline for the dodo. Well, externally, I should say. We've not set a timeline externally for the thylacine. But what I will say is that, with 22 months of gestation for elephants, it is highly likely we will see an animal before the mammoth.
So explain the science to me behind how you're using this ancient DNA to make this happen.
We basically go out and go to museums and go out into the field and we get ancient DNA, which is highly fragmented. And then we use AI and software and a bunch of tools to reassemble a bunch of pieces of that DNA to kind of build a reference genome for that extinct species. And then we compare that to the genome of its closest living relative. So in the case of the mammoth, that's the Asian elephant. It's 99.6% the same genetically. It's kind of fun to know this, but mammoths are actually closer genetically to Asian elephants than Asian elephants are to African elephants. That fact sometimes blows people's minds. And then once we understand what genes really made a mammoth, we're not trying to clone mammoths. We're not trying to assemble full, complete genomes and then synthesize them. We're trying to identify the core genes that have been lost to time that drive the phenotypes or physical attributes, like what made a mammoth shaggy coat, what gave it this subcutaneous fat layer, what gave it the curved tusk and dome cranium. And then with that and the resulting pathways, how do we engineer those into the cell line of an Asian elephant? And then from there, we use a process called cloning, also known as somatic cell nuclear transfer, to take that edited nucleus in that cell, put it in that of an egg cell, and then we put it into its closest living relative. In the case of the mammoth, that's the Asian elephant. And then if we're successful, 22 months later, we get a birth of a little baby mammoth.
And now, from Meet the Writers, the show that Georgina Godwin hosts, where she speaks to all the best authors around. Writing a fourth memoir is somewhat unheard of, but for Peter Godwin, it's an even more personal note. Not a grief memoir so much as an exploration in memory of the passing of his mother, the end of his marriage, and moving on. Peter shares the poignant moments of his life so far in Exit Wounds. He joins Georgina Godwin, his sibling, to discuss childhood memories of their mother, the process of his latest work, and writing multiple autobiographies of his life so far.
Peter Godwin, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you, Georgina.
Thank you, Georgina Godwin. Yes, I expect the listeners have probably made that connection. Peter Godwin is, in fact, my brother, and it's really wonderful to have you here across the microphone from me. I mean, if I were feeling particularly mean, this would be a chance to really, really grill you about our childhood and perhaps get my own back. But actually, the way I normally start these interviews is talking about people's youth, where they were born in a literary household, what that was like. But of course, I know all that. To a degree, you're a little older than me, and so we had a kind of separate childhood in a way. And I think it would be really interesting, particularly for me as well as our listeners, to hear what that was like as a small boy growing up in rural Zimbabwe.
Yes, I think there was a kind of schism in the family history, as it were. And when I was born and grew up in the Eastern Highlands of what was then Rhodesia, in a very, very remote area on the Mozambique border. Our older sister, Jane, and I were sent to boarding school very, very young. And it was a very sort of odd, pioneering, remote existence in the bush. And eventually, when you came along, somewhat of a surprise, I think, to our 43-year-old mother at that point, given that she was a doctor, there were no excuses. But Jane, our older sister, who was in many ways, I think, certainly even to me and definitely to you, almost more of a mother than our actual mother, who was always out wearing a white coat with a stethoscope around her neck, smelling of disinfectant, that Jane was almost more of a mother or maternal figure to both of us. And she commandeered me as part of a delegation. I was about 7 or 8 and went to Mum and said, listen, you can't do to Georgina what you did to us, which is essentially just sort of park us and walk away and do what she was made no bones about, which was her life's work, which was being a doctor, the only doctor in, I can't remember how many thousands of square miles. And it was absolutely clear to us that that was her priority. And oddly, at the time, I don't remember resenting it. I remember being proud of her and thinking that she was this incredibly important figure and how much respect she commanded in the community. But I do remember one of my first memories, in fact, when I must have been like 3 or 4 or something. I remember her going down on her knees so that our eyes were level and saying to me that what she really needed me to be was a big boy and to sort of be independent and do my own thing. And of course, as a child, you want to do what the parent asks you because you think that's how you're going to get them to love you. And of course, that was basically the last time I saw her because, I tried to do all that. But in a life as long as the one that she was ultimately fortunate to have, we talked about it. In fact, in this book, I've discussed that, and I talked about it with her, and it was kind of, interesting, to have the chance much later in life. But there was a kind of sad symmetry in a way, because I think I spent the first 10 years of my life trying to get her attention, and she spent the last 10 years of hers trying to get mine.
I mean, you talk about your childhood in your first memoir, Mokiwa, and we learn a lot about that, and you revisit that in Exit Wounds. And one part that really, really affected me was the small boy writing from boarding school, where you had to go very early because of the war. There was no way the parents could do that commute, begging for Valium.
It was strange. I mean, the way you block things out, and I always knew there were things that you have the power to block things out, but I didn't realise it could be that kind of complete. And when Mum died, as you recall, we found a sort of trove of letters that I had written home from boarding school. Only a couple of ones from them back to me, but all these little letters, and you can see the first ones are in sort of pencil, in kind of ransom demand kind of capitals, all misspelt. And then eventually they become cursive and they turn to biro pen and whatever. The letters are basically sort of, we were forced to write a letter a week, I think it was, and they're sort of fairly bland, but they're always asking, when are you going to come, and when are you going to come and visit? And then I discovered these ones referring to Valium and saying, my supply of Valium is almost out, please send more. And I'd kind of just edited that out of my memories. And now I realize that for some years, I was on Valium as a really small child, just to kind of cope with boarding school. And the letters were written so long ago that when I read them after, the passage of God knows, 50 or 60 years almost, it was like they were letters from my childhood self to my adult self. It was like they were from this little boy who it was reaching across the decades to me as an adult.
And of course, as children, and indeed even as adults for some time, we had no idea that there was this history of depression in our family, but it was circumstantial because of what happened to our father. And now that's something you reveal in your second memoir, When a Crocodile Eats the Sun.
Yes, I mean, none of us, as you well know, were aware of our father's real identity. He had this sort of made-up identity. To meet him, as you well know, to see him striding around the bush in a safari suit and desert boots and a walrus moustache and speaking in a clipped British colonial sort of military accent and with a kind of sort of emotional force field around him. He seemed quintessentially sort of British colonial in Africa, blah, blah, blah. And then when he thought he was on his deathbed, when he had a heart attack, he revealed to us that actually he wasn't English at all. He was a Polish Jew, and all his family, nearly all his family, being killed in the Holocaust. And he had this sort of secret identity that Mum, of course, knew about and was the only person who knew about it in Africa. He cut off all ties when he arrived there, changed his name to a name from her side of the family. And she sort of had to be his protector, I think. And I think he, looking back on it, I mean, there were no such thing as therapists and stuff where we lived. But I mean, he suffered from very, very deep, dark, long depressions. And when I asked her about it, in the last few years, even when I was doing this book, about that, she said, yes, he would go into these depressions, which would sometimes last for months, and he would essentially stop speaking completely. I mean, he would sort of ask, you to pass the salt, but nothing else. And she said he was unavailable in those, and in retrospect, she was sort of trying to create a kind of moat around him to protect him, I think.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
You are listening to The Curator, a weekly highlight show here on Monocle Radio, and I am Fernando, Augusto, Pacheco. And now a highlight from the menu. This time we were joined by acclaimed chef René Redzepi of Noma in Copenhagen and executive producer Matt Golding ahead of the release of their new documentary series, Omnivore.
For some reason, it feels it was almost the most difficult part of making this show was coming up with a name that we all could agree on. That's how I remember it.
It was. I mean, I can remember having reams of paper here in Noma of just hundreds of names. And we ended up with omnivorous at first. And that was kind of what we were going with for a little while. And then we just shortened it to omnivore. And I think omnivore ultimately, of course, is who we are, right? We eat a little bit of this, we eat a little bit of that. It's a wide open menu. We're not here to cover one specific corner of the food world as much as we are to really explore all of its breadth and beauty.
And Matt, the documentary is so beautifully shot, and you've, of course, worked on plenty of other food television, most notably with the late Anthony Bourdain. What made you decide to choose a documentary series for this project, and why is visual storytelling so important when it comes to food?
I mean, I think when you look at food television, obviously it's come an incredibly long way over the last 20 years, and people like Anthony Bourdain did an incredible amount of work in sort of showing the world that food is more than food, right? I think he did a really special job in particular when it came to food and politics and food and culture. But when Renee came and called me up and said, hey, would you be interested in working together? It was a dream, because what Renee has always done so well in his cooking and at Noma and his relationship with food is tying it right back to the natural world. And that meant, I think, one of the first pieces of inspiration that Renee shared with me was Planet Earth. What if we took the scope and the scale and the sense of wonder and awe that you feel when you watch David Attenborough do his thing in a nature documentary like that, but we applied it to food? What could we do with that? And I think ultimately what we tried to do with Omnivore was tell both these big, wide, broad stories with, the kind of the gorgeous visual storytelling that you can do in the world of documentary, as well as these very specific, intimate tales. And so we'd have episodes where we traveled tens of thousands of kilometers around the world, like Chile, where we moved from Renee's childhood in Macedonia to Louisiana to Bangkok and back to Copenhagen. And then we have episodes like Pig, where we just live in one small village in central Spain. I think it's those textures, it's that way to kind of twist the aperture of the camera, so to speak, so that you don't fall into a formula, that you use every episode as an opportunity for a different style of storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the listener who won't have watched the series yet, it's split into 8 episodes with ingredients as titles. So coffee, banana, chili, salt, tuna, pig, rice and corn. Why these ingredients in particular?
Well, we had a list of, I think we have a list still of more than 100 ingredients through which we could have made this show. And at first, perhaps there was a few more big world-altering staples on there, like we could have had potatoes on there as well, for instance. But we quickly saw that if we were to do that, we're worried that the stories would be too similar. We'd needed a range of stories and to have all the different concepts for each episode be loose and not terribly tied to one another. So, for instance, you can have chile, which is an ingredient unlike corn or rice that hasn't changed the fate of nations, or that doesn't offer any giant caloric value in a daily life. It's a love story that we have. And so that, is a theme for our episodes, and probably will be if we ever get to do a season 2. The theme is love, that we fall in love with things as a people, and it's something that seasons our food and makes us happy, and so that's kind of how we chose it. Once we really start diving into it, how do we build these stories properly? How do we, Matt always said, make the concept album where each tune is like different to one another. And at the end of it, you've really been somewhere. You've explored and you felt something.
And now to the world of photography, a highlight from the big interview. London and New York-based street photographer Joe Meyerowitz sits down with Monocle's photography director Matthew Beeman to discuss quitting his job after working with Robert Frank, finding decisive moments, how smartphones changed the world, his love of Leica and large-format cameras, and how time has affected his photographs. Joel Merowitz, welcome to the big interview.
Thank you.
Before we get stuck into your new exhibition, I'd like to talk about your experiences growing up in New York a bit and what prompted you to pick up a camera in the first place. I know you had a background as an art director, so was there something that happened during your time as an art director which inspired you to...
Yes, one of those life-changing events that was totally unexpected.
Yeah.
I was actually a painter, studying painting in university, and then I was doing graduate school in art history in New York, and I had a job as a junior art director for a small agency. And I had designed a booklet for 10 teens. My boss was trying to sell products to young girls before they were teenagers. This is in 1962. And so I had designed a booklet, and my boss hired Robert Frank, who was a good friend of his. My boss was a guy named Harry Gordon, and he was friends with Dan Arbus and Winogrand and Lee Friedlander. And they were all the same age. They were about 10 years older than me. Anyway, he sent me down to watch Robert make the photographs for this book. And I knew nothing about photography. I was a painter. And when I was watching Robert photograph, I saw that he anticipated what was going to happen right in front of him. He wasn't really directing these two little girls who were doing after-school activities, but every time they did something, a gesture that had a particular kind of lift to it, a moment, he was there, and I would hear the click just as the gesture reached its epiphany in a way. And I thought, wow, this guy has timing and he understands something's going to happen. And all these ordinary things have a moment of beauty in them. And, I just recognized that. And then when I went out on the street after the shoot, the street was alive to me in a way that I had never experienced before. Something as simple as a person hailing a taxi with that outstretched New York gesture, or someone who was carrying heavy bags of groceries home and they were bent over and stooped under it. And suddenly the poignancy of human behavior and ordinary street life was stunning to me. And instead of getting on a bus and going back to my office on 53rd and 5th, I walked it, which wasn't a big deal, but I walked it because I wanted to be in the world. And I couldn't stop seeing small moments that had big feelings in them. At least that's what it meant to me at that moment. And I came into my boss's office when I finally got there, and he said, "How was the shoot?" And I said, "Harry, it was absolutely fantastic. I'm quitting the job. I'm quitting on Friday." And he said, "Oh, no, was it really bad?" I said, No, it was great, but I saw something that I never understood before." And I said, I want to be a photographer. I saw these moments, and I explained to him what I just said. And he said to me, "Do you have a camera, Joel?" I said, "No, I don't." He said, "Schmuck, you need a camera." And he reached into his drawer and he said, "Here, use this until you get a camera." And he gave me his Pentax. And at lunchtime, I went out and I bought 2 rolls of color film. And that was it. The guy said to me, "What do you want, color or black and white?" And I said, 2 rolls of color, please." And he gave me Kodachrome. And that is the greatest film of all time. And so, a few days later, I went out walking around trying to see, what is it that I would photograph? And I didn't know how to read the exposure, so I had a piece of paper that was in the Kodak box.
And
I read,
no light needed then either.
The sun is behind you. It's this exposure. Anyway, the first 2 rolls of film had some interesting pictures in them, to me at the time. And I thought, wow, there's so much here, and I just have to figure out how to be faster and in the right place at the right time. And when I had those 2 rolls of film developed, a young guy, just a year or 2 younger than me, was at the next light box in the lab looking at his pictures, and it was Tony Ray Jones. We were both art directors. We were not yet photographers. And we were looking at each other's pictures after looking at our own, and we decided to go out shooting together. And so for most of that first year, Tony and I photographed in color on the streets of New York. And then at night, we'd get our film back and look at them projected in my little apartment. And we would talk about, you should be closer, faster, more off-center, more of this. I mean, we were trying to find a language together.
Yeah.
And finally, Tony's visa ran out, and he came back to Europe, to England, and he became the Tony Ray Jones that influenced Martin Parr and a whole generation of English photographers.
You are listening to The Curator. We have another big interview now, more than a decade after reaching worldwide acclaim with his 6-volume autobiographical novel, My Struggle. The Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgaard has returned to the fictional form in the Morning Star series. Knausgaard sat down with Gunnar Gronlid to talk about the latest entry, The Third Realm, embodying new perspectives and his fixation with death, family and freedom.
I read so much when I was little, when I was a kid. And there were no art in that world at all. I mean, first time I was at an art museum, I think I was like 17 or 18 in a school trip, So that was kind of uncommon territory for me. But literature wasn't. It was in my blood, I think. But I started out with comic books.
Right,
That was what I read, really. And then my mother started to take a look into them, and she found incredibly much sexism, racism, all kind of ugly stuff. And this was in the 70s, And I still remember, it's true, it was all of that. So she forbid me to read comic books. Absolutely not. And then she started to take me to the library instead. And after swallowing my pride, I followed her and started to read. And then I just went back home with bags of books every week. And if you do that as a kid, then literature is, the natural thing, really, if you continue, I think.
It was the benefit that now she didn't know what you were reading? Unlike the pictures where she can just flip through?
Yeah, I think I did read stuff that I wasn't supposed to read. I had a brother that was 4 years older who kind of sometimes, could read that, and it's really, nasty or whatever, and I didn't, as long as it was, hardcovers, or as long as it was books, it was fine.
Yeah. And you've been in London now for a few years, after obviously growing up in Norway, living in Norway for a long time, and then Sweden, which everyone knows from reading My Struggle. Does it affect your writing or the way you think about writing or what you write about to be in a totally different space?
I think it does, but in a long-term perspective. So maybe in 10 years' time, it will have an effect, but not now. So I live my life, I'm very much in the family. I got a lot of kids, and it's the writing. That's basically what I do. So London for me is almost something I go down into town and occasionally, and I go to some museums. Yeah, it is there, but it isn't changing me, I think. But it is changing perspectives. Being in another country always does that. It changes. You are outside of the place you are in a little bit when you try to enter it. But you're also outside of the country you come from. So to me, it's always been like a perfect place to be a writer because I'm always on the outside. So I think that's part of the reason also why I lived in Sweden so long and now here. And I think it is is a benefit for a writer. But I'm not thinking that cynical about my life. But I think it is. I think that's what you gain. But it takes a long, long time to enter into a nation. I mean, just watching TV, you see some faces, never seen them before, but the other who sees them have a history with them going back, and it's that with almost every public person. There is a backstory, and if you don't know them, then they're just faces, and to enter that level, it takes many years, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I imagine sort of in life then, when you're in a totally new place, there might be a sort of a sense of alienation, but I've both read and heard you talk a lot about finding distance and sort of space between you and the writing. Does them being like in a new place and having some distance to the place that you're writing about actually help in that process?
Yeah, I think so. I would never have been able to write my struggle in Norway. It would have been impossible, really impossible. You need that distance, I think. And also writing is an inner process. It really is, at least to me. It's very much related to memories, so it's what's inside of you. And if you write about something, that's there, it doesn't match. It's always some different. If you start to check and if you start to want to make it accurate, then you will just fail. So actually, I wrote a book about London, or it's set in London, but I set it in 1986 because that's that's a foreign country for everyone now. So that made it possible even to go to place I got to know, because it was a different time.
And we like to end the show on a feel good story from the menu. We sit down with the Franco-Palestinian chef Fadi Katan to hear his perspective on the importance of keeping Palestinian food culture alive.
My food journey began like everybody else at the age of 6 months. My mother made a terrible mistake, was feeding me some cereal and then gave me a taste of a meat pie that's Palestinian called sfiha. Tried to give me some more of the bizarre wheat thing, which I spat away. And since then, I've been totally somebody fixated on food. I did start learning to cook, like a lot of people, in my grandmother's kitchen. It's not, I think every chef in the world will tell you this. It's really the first taste buds that develop. And then you're watching, if you're like a 2-3-year-old kid, you're watching in awe this like production happening in a kitchen. For me, it started there. I was lucky to have my mother's mother be this fantastic cook that she was. My mother's an exceptional cook. I actually still call her and ask her things like, so how do we do that recipe? Now she laughs and she's like, are you going to deconstruct it? Why are you asking me? I'm not going to give you those foundations, but she does. I started professionally. I studied hospitality in Paris with a strong focus on food. And I went back to Palestine in 2000 for the opening of a hotel I was working for. The second Intifada happened. We closed down the hotel and I stayed. And I actually joined my father's business, which is selling commercial kitchens. So I was on the other end of the spectrum. And I used that to organize the first Palestinian cooking competition. And I was shocked because most of the chefs competing were actually creating European-influenced recipes, because at a certain moment worldwide, there was this obsession of a duck à l'orange is more glamorous than your own cuisine. And that led me into starting to explore, how do I take our kitchen that is very traditional, that's very family-oriented, that's very much one large sharing dish, and how do I take that into the setting of a restaurant? I opened Fauda in Bethlehem in 2015. Beginning of Fauda was quite funny and risky, to the point where we were the only white tablecloth restaurant in Palestine. And people thought I was taking an enormous risk. I'm pretty stubborn. It worked. It worked because there was a space for it. It worked because we challenged people's perceptions. I realized at that time that there was a very strong desire to discover what Palestinian food was worldwide. And we're seeing all these chefs popping up a bit all over within Palestinian diaspora, starting to cook Palestinian food, starting to write Palestinian cookbooks. And then the London opportunity came up with a Palestinian who's the co-founder of Akub, Rasha Khouri. She reached out and said, look, what do you think of this idea? And we embarked on the journey of Akub. It's been a year now. It's been a fantastic year. I am extremely proud of the team that's working at 27 Uxbridge. I'm proud at plenty of levels. It's a team of 27 people that come from 17 different nationalities, and they're all cooking and serving Palestinian food. With a twist, definitely. It's my vision of what Palestinian food is. We're not a restaurant aimed at a community specifically. We are a restaurant, full stop. We happen to be Palestinian. We happen to be serving Palestinian produce, we happen to be serving Palestinian wines, but we are a restaurant. And opening up this food world, taking it out of a very community-oriented approach, I think is what everybody should be doing with any cuisine. I mean, we've seen recently in London more and more African cuisines being rewarded for what they're doing, fantastic chefs, where 10 years ago, those cuisines were very often limited to their communities.
And that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show was produced by David Stevens and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week, and thank you for listening.